Hello everyone, and welcome to this Azure Skåne meetup with Jakob Gottlieb Svendsen from Saxo Bank. And it will be very interesting to learn how you manage to run Azure at Saxo Bank. My name is Johan, and I am your host today. And we have a code of conduct for our event. You can find it through our meetup on the link in the upper right corner on the screen here. So just follow our rules and just be nice to everyone so we can have a really good event together. Thank you. And Azure Skåne, we are a meetup, which means we are a user group for people who are interested in Microsoft Azure. And we started in 2017, and we have now grown to over 900 members. And our purpose is to for our members to learn things, to have some great networking, well, virtual beers right now instead of real beers, and of course to have fun. And you are all very welcome regardless of your previous knowledge of Azure. So feel very welcome everyone. And this is the crew behind Azure Skåne. It is me, Johan. And I have worked with data management and Microsoft technology for about 25 years. And I worked both for small companies and for very large companies. And now I'm running my own consulting business. And I developed a mobile phone game that is using a lot of Azure services. And I've done a lot of Azure projects since actually the beta version of Azure around 2009. And Michael, do you wish to say a few words?
Yes, so my name is Michael and I'm a consultant working in Avana, Denmark. I primarily focus on Azure and I'm also a Microsoft Azure MVP. And very welcome. Looking forward to this show.
And then we have Magnus Mortensson, who is not here today, but he's a Microsoft Regional Director and he is also one of the crew members. And wouldn't it be very nice if we see a lot of activity on Twitter and Facebook around this event? So feel free, to take pictures and tweet and spread the word and use the hashtag Azure Skåne. And then we wish to say really a thank you to Microsoft for sponsoring us and to Foo Café for supporting us also with the live streaming, and when it's not Corona times, they have supported us with venue and food. So thank you very much, Foo Café and Microsoft. And now let the action begin. Welcome, Jakob Gottlieb Svendsen.
Thank you. Should I start sharing my screen here? Oh, I didn't even have to put the kids in the slide deck. They are already there. So let me open up the slide deck here. Yeah. So hello everyone. I'm Jakob Gottlieb Svendsen, and I'm going to talk about this managing Azure at Saxo Bank. So what I'm going to talk about today is an introduction to our bank and our Azure setup. Going to talk about what and why and do we really need to run at level hard, right? This is kind of like playing Doom on your computer and either selecting the easy way or the hard way. Working in a bank, financial institution is level hard, but it's also very rewarding when everything works. So how did we succeed and future improvements? So a little bit about myself. I am currently in Saxo Bank. I started last year in August. I'm the Chief Cloud Engineer, and I'm the technical product owner of the team called Cloud Foundation, which could be called the Cloud Center of Excellence. We have some of the same tasks. We control we make sure the cloud runs. We have all the base, the network in the cloud, the deployment methods, and all the stuff I'll talk about today. Before this, I've been as a consultant in a company called CT Global, and been there for 14 years. And for the last 7 years, I've been a Microsoft Cloud and Data Center MVP. So just about this month, actually, or I don't even remember what month it was, but around 2011, I talked at my first conference as a speaker. So I've been speaking at user groups and other stuff, and about 50 conferences since then. I am also the co-founder of the Cloud and Data Center user group in Denmark, where we also talk about Azure, and we started as the PowerShell user group. And then very recently, I started jakobsvendsen.com, where I do have a few posts around different subjects. Not so much yet, but I'll put it if there's anything interesting. Right. And of course, I have my 2 kids, Ella and Eliu. She is 3 and he is 1. So hopefully you won't hear too much in background, but my wife is trying to, I don't know, tie them to a chair or something upstairs to make them a little bit more silent. Yeah, but let's get started on the what and why. Because we have regulations. There are a global bank. We need to comply to many different regulations in this industry standard, such as, SOC 2 or SOC 2 Plus, from the Cloud Security Alliance recommendations, and more stuff similar to that. But there's also local governments, like Singapore has some high requirements on such things such as data and, of course, personal identifiable information. All that stuff is very critical. There's a lot of classified stuff in banking, of course. So, of course, we have a lot of things to follow and make sure that we can run in a smooth way is sometimes, of course, a little challenge. So what do you do in an enterprise company to keep control? Well, you use change management, but many companies do that, and everything in our change management, all production changes have to go through the CAB meeting, the change approval board. And that is every day. They have a meeting every afternoon, and they will have representatives for all areas and discuss exactly if it's okay or not. This is, of course, a method to stop if there's anything going the wrong direction. If there's any incident, we can stop any deployments, new deployments, etc. If there is anything more complex to explain, for instance, the people that the releasers, they will be invited to the meeting and can then explain why they want it, for example, or if it's something complex that needs a more data. But as you might know, some of this change management, it's a rigid process, right? It sounds like a very rigid process. It takes, a little while. And it's quite difficult to handle in a traditional IT already. And then we come to cloud, where it has to be much more flexible. So of course, a classic change management is pretty slow paced, but a good thing is that it includes lots of control. But that doesn't really work with agile development, right? Because that's fast paced. And what do we have no control when we do agile development? That's the thing. We need to make people work agile, but still have the advantages of the classic change management, but still be able to roll out things and changes when we need to. And for specific components in the cloud, we need to be able to deploy at any time of day. If a solution is good enough and designed to be able to be rigid enough, robust enough for live or continuous deployment, of course, we need that to be possible too. So how do we do that with the change management, right? Well, how do we provide safe environments while staying agile? So first I need to talk about how our rules are built up, because what is it that we have to follow? Of course, we have the change management, and I'll show you later how we automate that part. But what do we need to follow here in the cloud? Well, we have this thing we wrote, co-worked with Microsoft, called the Cloud Security Framework. And as it says here, a few snippets from the introduction, says this framework specifies what security controls must be implemented on workloads on public clouds, and when these controls must be implemented. So these controls in this framework address confidentiality and integrity only, except for security controls that mitigate attacks on service availability, like DDoS protection, with availability and recovery requirements being part of the platform and workload design. So what does that mean? Well, this means that this is coming from our security department, and they only care about what is security risk. So a workload or an uptime risk, an SLA risk about not having the greatest availability is not for the security department to define. So for that, we have an onboarding process for each new workload that go through, and we discuss and discuss the design and make sure that that is followed correctly. I'll also touch that later. So the idea about the cloud service, the cloud security framework, is that it is cloud service provider agnostic. So this is not Azure specific or Amazon specific, but it is concrete examples of what and how to put functional descriptions in Azure context. We do have information around how we have implemented it in Azure, which are our platform. Surprise. So we have different levels of the security framework. There is things that only applies to playground and not to anything else. And that is stuff like that. It's that is the different. We have, of course, the playground, and then we have the standard, which is like 80% of our setup, or at least expected that everything fits into this. That 80% fits into this standard label. And then we have advanced, and that is, of course, when we have something with high confidentiality or criticality. There could also be, in some certain situations, with personal identifiable information, if they have to be used in a certain way, well, maybe that solution requires a higher level of security if that solution is delivering something to somebody, like another bank, some of our partners. Well, in that case, we might need to mark specific workloads as advanced. So playground rules are, of course, specific things like not use too much money or close temporary stuff down, make sure to clean up. Standard is more of the stuff that follows any general workload. And all of these are based on this different group information classification. You see there's a little information down here if you want to look up some more details on that. Yeah, so I have been allowed to show an example from it, so that's great. This one is the D7 control, which is part of the standard controls that spans the what we call the D tab, which is development, test, and acceptance and production. This means that all of our environments are, except playground, of course, all of our connected environments, because this one talks about connectivity to CSP private, and CSP private is our cloud service provider private network. This means that any device that is, or any resource, of course, that is attached to a network that is within our Saxo network boundaries is has to follow this one. And what it actually says is simple things like we need to have a layer 3 firewall to be able to follow a specific network compliance standard. But if we have an HTTP call, the first point here describes that we would like a web application firewall or equivalent, which is a improved firewall for web calls, right? So these ones, they describe it in a generic way, and then we can figure out how to implement it. Yep. So that is kind of our background of what we do. This is our base, and of course, this security framework, I don't know how many controls are there, like 40 or something like that. And of course, we then use those in different scenarios, and there are different implementations that helps with those. One is our security controls setup, and of course, we have logs we need to collect. We collect those into log analytics at the moment. We have policies, Azure policies, such as you need specific tags or connectivity that would block public IP use. And we have actually almost ready a new version of our security controls that is more based on policies and built-in Microsoft policies and less based off custom code. And then also have more policies than we had before. So a lot of our current setup is based on PowerShell based runbooks. And that is, for example, to collect specific information to log analytics. And then you might think, why are you using runbooks to that? You can just set a resource to send its logs. That's correct. Any resource in Azure can send its diagnostic logs to a log analytics, but you need something to enable it. So we have runbooks that scans our stuff in an interval and make sure that any other logging setting, for example, if somebody had deleted it or if they had deployed a new thing where it wasn't there, well, it will be automatically added by our security control that makes sure that this is a central control that can override anything else and set these settings. These runbooks also modify stuff like firewalls on resources. They also do more advanced collection of logging where we, for example, log into SQL servers, check permissions inside the SQL server and generate some logs from that and put that into log analytics so that everything we have, even custom checks, every single result goes into the same log analytics workspace. And here I can maybe mention the first lesson learned, because it is good to split up in multiple workspaces in many cases. There is a good thing about having all your logs in one place, but if it gets too big, log analytics cannot handle it anymore. There's a maximum of 800 fields, just be very technical. So look into, and another thing is cost management, look into splitting it up in different ways so that you can easily control and figure out who is spending money. I mean, we are spending, I don't know, 10,000 euros, sorry, or 15,000 euros a month on this logging, right? So it's important to look into if anything is excessively logging and make sure that that doesn't happen. So alerts is then defined based on these logs. And this is great because then all of our alert rules are defined in Azure Monitor using log analytics queries, because everything is sent in there, as I said, right? But to make it easy for security and for them to work with the auditors that comes in a regular basis, right? It's almost like a weekly thing. Well, it's not, but it feels often, but it doesn't feel so often for me because usually I don't even know it, because they can simply use the base of all our alert rules here as the check up for the auditors. So it's actually defined in an Excel sheet, all of these alert rules and who will be sent and what is the interval and whatnot. And we then have a pipeline that downloads this Excel sheet and turns it into a JSON file and then deploys it to Azure Monitor. So this way we have a very human-like way of defining things so that we don't have to be involved with the auditors, and security can do it by himself. And then we still have a full automated solution to deploy it. Another thing we do is that everything you have to deploy to Azure, every single resource that you will put in Azure for production at least, needs to be certified by our Global Information and Cybersecurity Department, normally known as GICS. So this means that, well, you can in dev, or at least in Playground, you can run anything you would like. We will need to make sure that only compliant use of services. And that is, of course, first of all, what services can be used. And there is actually some they are certified for different levels. So, of course, one easy one is don't use preview stuff. Too bad, at least not in production, right? So if you start in dev, then you can hope that Microsoft completes it before you make it to prod, which, yeah, I don't know if I would recommend that. The next thing is configurations, right? So a storage account, right? It can you can connect to a storage account using HTTP or HTTPS. So we make sure that you can only deploy a service at a storage account with HTTPS, because we do not allow, which one of the other controls say, to run non-encrypted connections. So this way we can make sure things are done the way we want. That's one thing. Another thing is we also want to control some of the configurations a bit more so that a user of whatever service that needs to be on a VNet might not need to know themselves which VNet they can connect to, depending on if it's a standard VM or something like that. So if you understand what I mean, we can use that to have different, to have a little bit higher level of definition so that all the detailed configurations is inside our templates with it is, because we facilitate this in a central template repository, in short, a storage account, and this storage account is used to get these things. So the good thing is developers, they have one place to go. It's easy to access. They have, hopefully we have made them in a way where they're easy to use. So this means that when one developer team needs something and it's not there, then either we help them if we can, of course, or they themselves create a template and then it goes through us. So next time another developer team needs to make the same, they can use what the other team had made, right? So it saves some development efforts. Of course, it also sometimes introduces some steeper learning curve and other things, but it still, in the end, should save efforts. And most importantly, we are deploying security compliant services. So, and again, we can also then control stuff like we need to update specific things on services. So for example, an OS image on a newly deployed VM cannot be more than 30 days old in patches when it's deployed. It doesn't work that we deploy it and then update it right away. It has to be a confirmed image that is maximum 30 days old. So this we can actually control in our templates in a central place. So that means the standard use of services and more easy maintenance. And especially it minimizes the risk of misuse, because if we didn't do it like this, and there is an option to go around this and then get your solution certified in a much more slower process. But that means, okay, we need to check if you are using settings that are not allowed. Right sizing, there's many options in that. Usually, I'll go a little bit quickly over this, but usually some team will create an ARM template, and that is actually usually the development team themselves that needs to use the service. And then they make a sample JSON and they write a README file. Then they raise a pull request for my team and also the security team. That is at least what needs to be happen next here. And what we then check is, of course, that we check that the template is properly made, that it follow best practices, that you are using this and that in the template, and that it looks like the others. There's no weird concepts in it, and also the README documents. So we sign this README using a pull request. And then after we sign it as architectural review, we send it on with a new pull request to global security, who then checks. Actually, in fact, they mostly check the README, right? Because the README needs to explain exactly what limitations has been put in there to be compliant. And of course, the gigs team are not super experts in ARM templates, although they are learning, of course. And therefore, of course, the most important thing is the README. And of course, we then need to make sure in the architectural review that the README and the template is actually following each other, right? Yeah. And then finally, service owner, for example, the DBA lead for some databases, says, yes, I set my approval on this, and then it can be used in production. Before this moment, in the end here, it can be used in dev. Okay.
Jakob, we have some questions. Would you want to take them afterwards, or?
Yes. Sorry, it's I can't easily see him here, so because I need to jump out like that. Okay. For Eric, he asked, did you fully separate cloud and on-prem, and are there any shared services for monitoring security, backup, etc.? No, we did not. We have a 10 gigabit express route between on-prem but we have of course separated it by firewalls on both sides. And inside our on-prem network is of course a large number of firewalls too, to separate zones, and the same thing in the cloud. So no, it is still connected, and that is why it's called CSP private. It is because it's connected to the connection that has on-prem connection to the Saxo network. On the question around if we have any shared services, well, we are implementing right now Azure Backup for backup so that we can centralize that. And you will see in the end when I talk about the future that we have a few central things on what we call the reference architecture. But I'll get back to that later. Yeah, okay. So when you want to deploy something to the cloud, the most important thing in that is to know who pays for it. To be real honest, I don't care what they put in there as long as they use our approved methods, our compliant methods, and that they have a credit card. Well, we don't use credit card internally in the company, right? So what we use instead of a credit card is what's called a cloud application configuration item inside our ServiceNow. So when you want to deploy something to the cloud, you need to define stuff like which business services is under, who is the owner, what are the budget, well, if you want, but especially on budget side, who pays, right? And then there's also stuff like data and use, which I'll get back to in a second, and then any kind of support, right? Who is the support group? So I'll jump into one of those actually. But actually, just a second. Yeah. When you order one of these cloud applications here, this is one from my team, which I've been allowed to show. Here is the cloud app, right? And it has a name and it has a parent business service here. The business service itself, if we look at it as a preview here, is defining who owns this business service, who is managed by. There's deployment groups and approval groups for new deployments and all these things that needs to be done, needs to be available when you go through change management, for instance. But it also includes this one called financial account, which is a work package is called. And the work package here is my budget, right? So if I use this, then it's on my budget. So if we look at the cloud app itself here, it has a name, of course. You can order it in the self-service portal, and then it goes through a approval process for the owner, I believe, and then it comes in here. So in here you can see that it contains stuff like who is the IT owner, that is the responsible in the end, business stakeholder are managed by. This is the head of the department of my team, while I'm the technical lead. I'm the head of. And here you see there is also financial reference, but it's not filled in. But it says here calculated financial reference. And this means that if I don't define one on my cloud app, it's going to go up to the business service and take the one from there. But there are situations where a certain thing, let's say it's our Elasticsearch offering. Well, one of the Elasticsearch clusters is only for security events. So even though it's part of the Elasticsearch business service, well, it is on another budget. So each of the clusters would be a cloud app, and the actual offering would be the business service. So in this case, 3 of them is just normal, fine, but the 4th one has to be paid by security. So you go in here and you select something else. And if I were to click save here, you will see this calculated thing update. So therefore, when we deploy something, we need this on our resources. So if I go here, sorry, it seems to have closed my, second. Hate when that happens. You know, this one is not removing self, so little trick somewhere. Automatically hide. There we go. So if we look at this one instead, right, this is a correct browser. This is what I want to end up with. I want to have this tag on my resources here, because then it comes into my actual usage. I want to have my tags on my resource group because it's very difficult to control per resource. But we do have a policy that then copies the tags onto the resources, right? But there are more stuff here like the owner. So when an owner needs to check his or her budget, right, or costs, they can go in here. But there's also more here like the CI name, the cloud app name, and the cloud environment name. because we actually also have a split off in test, dev, and prod within each of these cloud apps here. But that is, and then this one, which is the Snow ID, which is the most important tag, because this is the link to this to the actual cloud app here. As you can see, the number is here. So you see, this is what I need to deploy something. Should I check for questions, or you will break in, right? Yeah. So what do we do to make this, to give the actual developers an option to do this themselves, to follow the rules and to deploy something and not go crazy? Well, of course, everybody gets lost and go crazy sometimes, but we will try. And usually we call eating our own dog food, right? And I thought about yesterday, we should turn in this new project into not having dog food anymore. Why is it called dog food? Can we make it even better so it becomes more gourmet food, right? Or just food. So we want to make some food that we can use and that they can use, and that works in a way that is good enough for everyone to understand and use and not be blocked by it. So one thing they need to do is that they need to be able to create a resource group. They need to be able to create as many resource groups as they want to, when they want to. But all we need is this link to the cloud app, right? We need them to run PowerShell scripts, but unfortunately, our security department says that PowerShell is dangerous, right? Well, what they say is PowerShell makes any scripting language here. If we can run those in this context here, it might be too dangerous to give as many free options as we have here. So what we have is an approved PowerShell script system where you can suggest with a pull request a script, and we review it and we accept it, and now you can use it. So it's an, again, approval process for same as our templates. We also have for app registrations in Azure AD. So when you need to create an app registration, you can actually do that from your pipeline without anybody's help or approval, as long as you don't use the name of something that some other pipeline is owning. And that also includes certificates. So when you want to make a secret or a certificate, and we prefer certificate authentication, but there will be support for secret also soon. But we need to generate a certificate for this app registration to be able to authenticate as the app registration. And we actually offer through our APIs some safe way to do that. So you can ask to have a certificate generated, placed on the app, and also injected into your Windows server, for instance. Or you can, in other cases, supply your own certificate. Or another third case, you can have a temporary certificate for 24 hours or 2 hours or whatever you need, and have a little bit more free hands on the actual certificate. And we are adding now that we also can have that certificate injected into AKS where it's needed. So you also have, so we can deploy shared a SQL database to our to any using what's called DAG pack, but also deploy identity and access into the database. So these things that we don't allow people to do because it would be too dangerous, we offer them in a custom API and in these DevOps tasks. Of course, we have package deployer to deploy code to VM and more. But of course, there are tasks that we allow, at least a few, and we allow our own. It's great. We are those that are from our DevOps team for deploying general stuff. Those are from those that my team own, which are Saxo Cloud tasks, change tasks, rotate keys, and also some, but we also use some of the built-in ones. For example, deploying an app service content, you use the app service deploy. If you manage and restart your app service, you use that one. You also use the standard deployment task to actually deploy your ARM templates. But we also use the one for storage, for Databricks, a few of those, and PowerShell script. But notice it's not the Azure PowerShell script. So yes, you can run PowerShell scripts, but you cannot run PowerShell scripts in the context of your Azure deployment. So you cannot make scripts that would change resources unless they go through the approved process. Yep. So this create resource group task is actually the key point in our setup. to deploy to Azure. And one is it's a gate to apply rules, right? We enable temporary access for the same stage in the pipeline. This actually means that when the connections that people are using in their pipeline and all the different teams are using in their projects, they are actually dummy credentials. They don't have access. But within the live execution of our thing, we give it temporary access. And I get much deeper into that in a second. We check for stuff because before we want to give them access, we need to check. And this gate here allows us to put any check we would like. So we check if banned tasks are used, right? We check if the template are correct, if it's using our approved templates, and besides our approved templates, there's only a few resources allowed to be deployed, such as role assignments. So you can make a deployment or you can make role assignments and a few more. So we check that. We also check actually that you are using the master branch of our templates, because in dev you can be allowed to make your own template, put it in your own branch, make a pull request for us. But even when we have not touched it yet, this branch will be available outside for the deployment if you're not running in production. So therefore, you can almost usually yourself get to a point where you can test your resource correctly if you are following these things. And then, of course, in production, there are small stuff like change request required, and that we only run deploy from master branch. I'll get back to that, all of this. Yeah, because I made this nice little diagram of it, right? So what happens is that Azure pipelines, and we have this thing called the SelfService API. This is kind of the central point where all of the teams, I believe we have around 100 development teams, that they can use in their pipelines to do these Azure actions. And of course, we have Azure, ServiceNow, approved template repo. And the first thing is you run your create resource group task. This task actually connects to the SelfService API. This task actually, the SelfService API receives your Cloud App ID that you wrote in your task, and it sends it to ServiceNow. Inside ServiceNow, we have a validation function that makes sure that the Cloud App ID that was sent has an owner and a work package, a calculated work package, so that we know who pays and we know who is responsible. And that it exists, of course. And that the work package is not blocked by finance because it's run out of money. So things like that, because this validation happens inside ServiceNow, it's very easy for us, my team, to go and change the logic if the organization changes the organization. And that is something that often happens in many organizations. So when we have validated the Cloud ID, we can return the tags that are required on the resource. So if I jump quickly to my list here, you see that the tags include stuff like what was the business service sys ID, cloud environment ID, criticality, environment type, all these things like financial, work package ID, or owner. That also means that if let's say one of these cloud apps, or let's say one of the business services actually has a number of cloud apps beneath it, right? And then each cloud app has, let's just go crazy and say 50 resource groups each. So that's about, let's say 500 resource groups. Now we need to change this because now it's a new budget that pays, or it's a new owner. So what do? Well, we simply change it in ServiceNow, and then we run a script that iterates through all of our resource groups and asks ServiceNow for the updated cost information. And voila, you have actually changed 500 resource groups for their cost information. So this is something I pushed for when I started last year. There was a validation function. It was not doing much, but we added so that it does the tags. And then it means that the developer here only have to know their Cloud App ID. Before we had this, they would have to know what work package and the owner and stuff, which also made it possible to maybe write something that was wrong. And that is what we are out of here. But it also, of course, means that you cannot deploy anything unless our API is running and the ServiceNow is there. So What happens then? It goes and creates and updates the resource groups, the resource group in Azure. But then it actually sends back a temporary access token that only have owner permissions on this specific resource group. And it actually have a little side permissions too, like being able to join a specific VNet or being able to read something in a shared key vault that is used. Stuff like that we can control in the API what permissions exactly it should have when it deploys. So it sets its own service connection credentials, and now we can do deploy template or any other of our tasks that we are using. And of course, our template is then using the approved template repo simply by using what's called linked templates in ARM templates. What has happened is that if we scroll back to here was also a temporary access token for the approved template repo sent back. And that is actually injected via parameters into the template and then used to get the approved template. And then it uses the template and it deploys the resources. This is what happens in dev and test. This is without the change flow. All right. If we take another one for production, it's the same, much of it, but it starts a little different because we need to create a change. And we need to wait for CAP approval. So this is where we have actually a create change task that goes and creates the change in ServiceNow. And we have an automated wait task. And we also have a system. So whenever it's allowed to continue from ServiceNow, then it continues. So yes, it's still a rigid process for changes that needs to have manual review. We cannot get around that for everything, but we can for some, which we call low risk CAP, which I get back to in a second. But the normal procedure would be to go through the board. And then same thing happens as before. Token, deploy template, deploy resources, and then mark the change request failed or completed. And now it's done. So this can take not much work at least, but it can of course take time if you have to wait for the CAP approval. Oh, that was a bit weird. Yes, so let's just take a little. No, before I show that, I just want to show this. This is what's called low risk CAP. And low risk CAP is actually a list of rules. And if you follow these rules in your project, you can be allowed to become low risk CAP approved. And of course, there are certain solutions or levels of criticality, whatever, that will never be low risk CAP approved, but most things can. If you just make sure that you are working in a trunk-based development method so that you have very much control that your master branch is not breaking itself or different, and you have automated testing, automatic rollback. If all of these things have been checked by the DevOps team and been checked off, yes, you have that. You can actually have it. You can actually have this. They then implement an entry somewhere that says this pipeline, this business services thing can deploy without waiting for CAP. So it will still follow the same process. It will create a change request, but it will change the change request in a way where it's not waiting for CAP because it's been allowed to do that. And that is what we can then use to deploy continuously as long as the solution is good enough designed to do it. All right. Yep. So actually I skipped the demo, so I'll go back to that. And the thing is we have a few pipelines here, and what we do here, which actually this is super recent, it's from this week, but what we usually do in Saxo is to make templates for stages, or we also make sample pipelines. So this is a sample pipeline, right? If I were to start on a new one, I would go here, add new stage, and I can actually select a template for automatic change. So if I have to make prod, right, I just select that template, and now I have the steps to make the change request that I just need to fill in. But for dev, as I said, it don't need that the change request. So all we do is run this deployment preparation task, where you select if it's environment dev or whatever it is and which subscription in dev it is, what your resource group name would be. But there's also this thing called availability hours, which is used for automatic shutdown of certain things. And then your cloud app ID. And then down here, criticality and environment type development. Because this is development selected here, and of course, development here, we do not need the change request. So no checks will be done for that. But we will still check that we are not using any tasks here that are not allowed. So when this is run, it will check its own stage, which is these three, and it will make sure none of these are using templates that are including that includes, you know, non-allowed actions. Yep. For production, of course, it looks slightly different. So here we come with the change thing, and we write, you know, our business service here, and we have the wait, and we also have this thing called mark in progress, so that when the deployment start, the actual change is in progress. And now the same thing happens in here, but you see that the production is chosen here, and especially the environment type production down here. With this production selected, this task will go back into the pipeline and make sure that this one has outputted a correct information around a change request. So it will check that we haven't skipped that part, and then we can deploy to production. So, and then of course, if it's successful, we mark it as closed, mark it as successful or failed. All right. Yeah, so this is the way it makes it possible for anyone, as long as they know how to do it. And that's of course the biggest issue with having a decentralized self-service setup, is how do people get started? Do we have the right guides? So like 25% of this quarter, my team is working on improving documentation on different things that have been discovered missing. And even if you just write a lot of documentation, it's not certain that people can find it. So documentation is maybe the hardest task in this thing here. One thing that I have added recently, it's actually not in production yet, simply because I haven't had time to deploy it, because there's a big configuration file that I need to write for this specific solution. But this is an idea of adding extra tags to everything that is deployed to Azure. So when we write something to a resource group, we have an event called event resource group write. This goes into the event grid in Azure, and we can then subscribe using an event grid subscription to this event, which makes it possible for us to trigger an Azure function that then goes and adds more tags. That could be, in this first edition, we have created by, modified by, either time or who did it. These calls that you get in the event grid, the data you get, the metadata, you actually have the whole token for the call to the Azure API. So you can pick out anything from identity that you would like. And then of course you can do other things like making sure the resource group is correctly tagged or something like that. So first I would like to introduce my, if I can open it here, I don't know. Am I allowed to open it inside Saxo? Yes. Okay. Here is my jakobsvendsen.com, and in here you see that I see the scaling looks a bit weird at the moment, but this is the function that I talk about and what it does here. I'm not going to go through everything, but it triggers on an event here, right? And logs the event. But then down here it says we are going to add modified date, modified by name from the claim, which is the token for the API, and then modified by ID, and then we get that from there. And if there is no created by tag already, then we're going to add a created by tag. But this is just the start. This will trigger on everything. So this thing about validating stuff in ServiceNow, I'm planning to actually add that to this function later, so that we can simply, anybody can make, for example, one team is using Ansible. Up here, you're actually here. So, and that's great. but it would be great if anybody could deploy any way they would want, and then just make sure that it has a tag called no ID. And then when it's deployed, we're going to trigger this function. We're going to validate that the ID that was in that tag is okay. And if it's okay, we are going to add the rest of the tags, like the owner and all that stuff. If it's not okay, we are maybe going to set market as non-compliant and have an alert for security, or not for security if it's just a cost issue, right, for my team, and figure that out. So of course, this is also in the plans to. This would also make it possible for us to at every night, for instance, make a small update on each resource group using, let's say, update the tag, change the status tag to be updated. And then this function would trigger, it would ask ServiceNow about any changed cost information. So all this thing about who owns what could actually be pulled out of the IT and actually be handled inside ServiceNow only, so that not only our engineer team here can understand what happens, but anybody can change owners with anybody, and then you know that next hour or next day it's updated. So I can really recommend looking into this kind of event-based tagging, or event-based event-based check validation. Is there any questions before I continue to the last part?
No questions at the moment.
Okay. I hope people are still here. Let's see. Oh, there are still people. Thank you. Okay. We can of course have time for more deeper questions in the end if you want to ask anything.
If you want questions, I have one.
Yeah, you can have one now.
On the pipelines, is there a reason why you haven't transitioned over to multi-stage pipelines yet?
To the YAML based?
Yes. Maybe you answered it when you said YAML.
Oh,
yes.
I did not. I did not answer it, and yet. Well, two things. One, this is TFS on-prem. And why is it on-prem? Well, that's because most of our code is super secret, and it's not actually allowed to be hosted outside Saxo. So the main tenant, or the main DevOps, is on-prem based, the Azure server, and the YAML based pipeline came for a few months ago, or let's say it's maybe half a year ago, and I believe we have had it for some months now. But to introduce all of our tasks into a YAML based one is not complete yet. So that's why we are still using the graphical ones for the release, because we have so many custom tasks. But we are working, for example, the ServiceNow. Well, now I can't open the secret, the organization, as we've been recorded, but the ServiceNow tasks are supported in YAML now, and yeah, and someday soon we will have to, in my team, also prioritize and get them tested properly in YAML. Unfortunately, it's not one-to-one with the support of how they work, so that's why it's not there yet. Especially some of the tricks that we make on setting the credentials and or checking stuff in the environment variables and stuff. It works a bit different in YAML than it does here. But yeah, I would like to go to YAML, of course, and we are making everything new in at least build pipelines in YAML, but there are still some release here. All right. So, but that is of course to the future, because with the new setup we have and what is being set up is, first of all, cloud environment CI. So it's a child of the cloud app, right? So when you deploy, you define your cloud app and you define your environment. So each of these cloud apps will automatically get dev, test, and prod environments created when you create the cloud app, which I should of course show. If we go here, right, and you go down here, environments, we have development and production in this one, and I can add more environments here. Actually, a little side note is that these environments, they actually have some of the types that you add actually have automation that triggers inside ServiceNow when you create it, which actually triggers, let's say you make a DT environment, Well, it actually triggers the creation of a DT, or at least part of preparation to deploy. DT is what we called our dynamic test environments, which is kind of a copy of the on-prem setup that you can order and have automatically provisioned. So at the moment, we have around 50 copies of our on-prem setup running in different contexts. And it's, of course, a big expense, but it's a super flexible way for each of the development teams to be 100% sure that they work in a copy of the live environment, but also in their own isolated environment. Every Monday, almost all of them are reset, deleted, and 1,800 VMs are redeployed. And that is working fairly well considering how many gears that are there. So the cloud app here, right? So when I deploy something to development and I define my cloud app, well, our little validation function can say, hey, you chose that it was environment type D, which is development. So I find your development environment and then I return the ID of the environment. So without you thinking of it, we already have tagged this as being part of a sub environment in a cloud app. This is, of course, very valuable when we need to make cost management reports that shows cost in the different environments, right? So this is, of course, something that we are introducing. Right now, we are checking cost on resource groups, but it would be great to have a better view that doesn't involve checking 100 resource groups if you ever would make that many. So this is one thing that we've recently introduced. So it's also returned, and it provides then a split for us. And if it doesn't find the environment that you chose, it just says, okay, who cares? And then it doesn't return it. So it's not mandatory as of yet, but it might be when you change the when we make the process a little bit more, we enhance it all the time. And the same thing with the meta tag, the event grid thing that I talked about. I really want to make this as soon as possible, but of course we have a million things to prioritize. But that every time you write to a resource group, it actually takes the cloud app ID from the Snow ID and it validates the information, updates the owner financial account created by, so on and so forth. And this could be extended to even check naming standards or whatever you would want, right? There's one thing that one of you might have thought about, I don't know, but the one question we've had many times, a discussion is, why do you allow people to deploy templates that are made by you instead of making policies that would block all the actions that they are not allowed to do? The thing is, there are so many actions that you are allowed to do that it's very difficult to make sure that you 100% cover all of the things you are not allowed to do. And when we have the templates, we can actually go and also make sure that specific things in configurations are inputted for you so that you don't have to define it yourself, right? So with this, meta tags, automatic adding, you could do any kind of deployment without any templates, and we would still get all this stuff on it. But it is difficult, in my opinion, to make sure you cover everything. So security likes better that we do it the other way. It also works pretty well. But what we are going to use in the future, are using currently, and there's a few things in production, is a new reference architecture platform. And that is, of course, a way to say, we have a lot of on-prem services, right? We have made web services for 20 years plus. So of course we have a lot of things still running on premises. We haven't used technologies that clouds doesn't support it yet, or actually doesn't support. So there are a lot of things that were running on the on-prem reference architecture, and now comes the cloud-based reference architecture. And the reference architecture is not to mandatorily force everyone to do the same. No, it's to give them a buffet instead of having them to make their own food, so that they can go and say, okay, I want to make a standard service. How do I do that? Of course, here in the beginning phases of all of things, there are so many things that are needed, right? So it can be quite confusing. But when all of those child illnesses are gone in the processes, then we have a very nice setup, and we already have lot of good experience. That there are, of course, as I say, when hundreds of teams are working on something new, there are new things discovered all the time. But we are in a very good state where people can use the Kubernetes, and we do use AKS for that. So we have, of course, an internal, what's called Artifactory. It's here in the internal package image source, a JFrog server, so that any Docker images or any libraries to the code will come from a curated place, a Saxo-owned repository. We have Elasticsearch, which we will use for any kind of logging. So all of these log analytics that I talked about in the beginning, we are of course investigating whether we should put them in our Elasticsearch instead. We have Kafka, so that we have a central place where you can have a message broker that an event-based system where you can send in an event and multiple different other solutions can subscribe to it, so that we can have these solutions help each other in a common ground there. And then we of course have a layer of monitoring on top of Elasticsearch, which is the Kibana. And of course, we have more in this, such as special vaults or whatever we would need for this. And then we have a security framework, which is now being implemented in an inside Kubernetes implementation, so that it's using Kubernetes policies to make sure some of these things that we have as rules are being followed. So the platform here gives, hopefully, gives the developers a much quicker way to production if they use the standardized methods like the Saxo logging framework, Saxo authentication framework, or whatever they are called, right? This is the whole idea. Yep. And this was actually the last thing I had. And my tag or Twitter tag is Jakob G. Svendsen, and it's also the same on LinkedIn and GitHub and PowerShell Gallery, and in my new website on jakobsvendsen.com. And thank you for that I could come. And if there's any questions, I'm super open to hear them.
Thank you very much, Jakob. That was really great. One question from me, because you said you started around a half year ago or something like that at Saxo Bank.
In August, last year.
Yeah. I mean, this must have taken really a lot of work to build up all these kind of things.
Yeah, so you cannot, I cannot take the honor. I should have said that in the beginning, because of course I did not design this setup. This setup was exactly like this when I arrived. I have introduced maybe some polishing on the processes and these things about the validation and dynamic tagging. That's something I have introduced, right? But this is something that has been worked on since 2019, and I believe it's January or so. And it's something that is continually worked on and is never complete. So I believe we have 50 open features at the moment on just this, just our team, right? Because there are either templates or controls that need to be optimized, or suddenly somebody says, hey, I want to use PostgreSQL. Okay, great. Yeah, we need a template, right? But we also need tasks to deploy and identity management and checking the different permissions and stuff like that. So I cannot take the credit for all of this. I'm super happy to come into a setup where it was made in this say almost brilliant way. I would say, of course, it has its lacks, and there are lots of bad experiences and good experiences too. So yeah, I'm super happy to be there.
Yeah, that's really impressive. So any more questions?
No, I just see people saying thank you, Jakob. Great session.
Welcome to type in the chat or on the live stream on YouTube.
Thank you.
I had a thought when you presented in the beginning there, where you talked about the run books. Probably these run books now, when I hear the history, they've been worked on from the start, maybe even before there were policies available. So, for example, making all the services log to the log analytics space. There is policies for that today, but is there any learnings why the run books are better in those cases?
That's a very good question, brilliant, and thank you for asking it. One thing is, yes, you are completely right. Most of these was made before policies was, maybe they were there, few of them, but at least there were many in preview, right? And we can't use that. So of course it's what made because, but in the exact example of log analytics onboarding on the diagnostic settings, we actually right now, as I also mentioned, is that we have some Microsoft consultants helping us in making the new version of our cloud implementation of the framework. Here we have replaced, let's say we have 30 runbooks. I believe we have replaced at least 20 of them with built-in policies. And they have designed a way to assign these policies using some JSON files so that we have an overview of all the different areas. Because the challenge is in logging, for instance, are you sending to one place or are you sending to multiple places? So if you're sending to multiple places, are you sending based on which device it is, or are you also sending them multiple places based on which category of logs it is? And there might be limitations in the built-in policy or even in the policy system to support a flexible way of saying, okay, if you are that type of resource, you need to send these 3 types of logs there and the rest there. I'm not sure. That's actually what we are I'm having on my to-do very soon to figure out if it supports our setup. But this is because why we have the runbooks. It's either because nobody knew about policy back then, or it didn't exist, and most of them have been replaced in a new one. But I believe we still have 4 or 5 or 6 of the controls which cannot be handled by policy. For example, the most advanced one is the one that checks if anything development, app registration have access to anything production. To do that, you need to check RBAC, you need to check inside SQL servers, inside PostSQL servers, different things. So we have a runbook that has these modules where we can add support for checking and getting, access permissions out in a standardized way, putting it into log analytics, and then we can make alerts that actually not only looks at the outside of the resources, but also on the inside. Of course, maybe it can be done with guest configuration now. But yeah, I would go with policies first, custom runbook second, always.
Thank you.
Any more?
I see some.
Yeah.
I just want to extend a thank you for a wonderful session from the YouTube live stream also, Jakob.
Thank you. First time live on YouTube, I believe. At least on purpose. All right. Yeah, thank you for letting me come and speak here. It's even though I'm a bit rusty, it's great. I'm looking so much forward to having the next in real life conference somewhere that includes some heavy networking at night.
Yeah. Yeah, after this Corona things, you should come over and we have a follow-up presentation with you.
Yeah, so maybe I'm allowed to by then to show the new assignment system of the policies that I just
very interesting. That would be a later event for us. That would be really great.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. So yeah, I think if we don't have any more questions, I think we say thank you very much, Jakob. It was really our pleasure to have you here, and it's a very interesting presentation.
Thank you. And anybody's welcome to contact me on Twitter or whatever, of course. So thank you.
Perfect.
So